5,000 Aboriginal rock art sites are confirmed in Kakadu, but nearly 10,000 more may still be missing from the map. And inside that same under-recorded country, Kakadu's Madjedbebe rock shelter produced a date so old it pushed Australia's arrival timeline back by 18,000 years. Most visitors never feel that pressure. They hear tyres humming on the park road, smell dust and hot eucalyptus through the window, stop where the signs tell them to stop, and leave, thinking they have seen the important part. Fair enough. The public Kakadu is already huge, but the hidden Kakadu is bigger. Much of the sandstone escarpment cannot be reached by vehicle. Behind those cliffs are ledges, shelters, and stone faces that have barely been surveyed or never surveyed at all. So, when scientists talk about discoveries here, they are not talking about a finished record. They are talking about a record with blank spaces still breathing. And one of those spaces led straight to Madjedbebe. If you want ancient Australia without the tourist brochure filter, subscribe now, because this date is only the beginning. To understand why Madjedbebe mattered so much, you have to stop picturing Kakadu as a neat park with a few marked stops. The stone country does not behave like that. Tracks end. Heat comes off the rock in waves. Paper maps suddenly feel too clean for the place they are trying to describe. In the wet season, whole areas can change character, with water, mud, insects, and swollen crossings deciding where a person can go. That matters because archaeology depends on access. A shelter has to be reached before it can be recorded. A wall has to be seen before its art can be listed. A sediment layer has to be opened carefully before anyone can argue about its age. When researchers look toward the escarpment, they are looking at a record with gaps made by cliffs, distance, and country that must be approached properly. And near that difficult edge sits the shelter within the Jabiluka mineral lease, where the next question became unavoidable. Who gets to decide how deep the past is allowed to be read? That question is why the work at Madjedbebe cannot be told as a simple story of scientists arriving with tools. The shelter sits in Mirarr country. Before a trowel touches the floor, before a sample bag is labelled, there is another kind of knowledge already present. Names, responsibilities, boundaries, memory, and care. The research that later changed the arrival timeline was done with Mirarr Traditional Owners, and that detail is not decorative. It is central. Picture the shelter itself, dry stone overhead, fine dust underfoot, the smell of warmed rock and old earth. Voices drop in places like that. People move more carefully. Every scrape into the floor has weight because it opens a record that belongs to living country. University of Queensland teams excavated there in 2012 and 2015. They worked through layers that had built up grain by grain, season by season, long before any modern map named the lease around it. And deep in that ordered earth, the old consensus began to feel less certain. That uncertainty did not come from one dramatic object pulled from the ground in a single clean moment. It came from a chain of careful work. Samples had to be taken. The position of each find had to be recorded. The floor of the shelter had to be read like a slow document, with each layer holding its own place in time. You can almost hear it. The scrape of a tool, the soft fall of sand, the low talk of people checking labels before anything leaves the site. Then came the harder part. The dates had to survive other scientists looking closely at them. In 2017, the results were published in Nature, one of the journals researchers pay attention to when a claim is large enough to disturb a field. And this claim was large. It pressed against the accepted model of when people first reached Australia. The old figure had seemed stable for years, until the numbers from this shelter arrived. The number that arrived was about 65,000 years. For a field used to, speaking carefully, that was a hard sentence to ignore. The older working figure for human arrival in Australia had sat around 47,000 years. Madjedbebe pushed that back by roughly 18,000 years, which is not a small adjustment on a chart. It changes the questions people ask about movement, coastlines, climate, and how early people understood this continent. Now, that does not mean every argument ended in 2017. Good science does not work that way. Big dates get tested, challenged, checked against methods, and argued over in conference rooms where the coffee is bad and the stakes are high. But the shelter had crossed a line. Its evidence was no longer local. It had entered the global discussion of human history. And then came the part that made the date feel even heavier. Because the people in those deepest layers had left more than age behind. What they left behind matters because it changes the picture in your head. In the deep deposits at Madjedbebe, researchers were not just finding signs that people had passed through and vanished. They were finding worked stone, traces of pigment, grinding activity, and evidence of people making practical choices in that shelter again and again. The dry floor held tiny fragments with large meanings. One of the strongest images is the ground edge axe. Hold that idea for a second. A shaped tool made with skill, coming from a world so far back that the usual schoolbook timeline starts to feel far too small. There was ochre too, the kind of material that can speak to marking, color, ceremony, and body or surface use, depending on context. Imagine red dust on fingers, stone against stone, the soft rasp of grinding in the shade. So the 65,000-year date did not point to a bare survival camp. It pointed to people with technique, memory, and purpose. And if that was true at one shelter, what was still sealed across the wider stone country? That question pulls Madjedbebe out of the shelter and back into Kakadu's wider map. Because once one protected pocket of stone can hold evidence that old, the empty spaces around it start to look different. A blank area on a survey map may be blank because nobody has been there with the right people, at the right season, with enough time to look carefully. This is where the scale becomes hard to sit with. Kakadu has about 5,000 confirmed Aboriginal rock art sites. Archaeologists think the true number may be closer to 15,000. That gap is not a rounding error. It is a whole hidden record, still waiting beyond the places most visitors ever see. Imagine a sandstone wall under a shallow overhang, wasp nests in the corners, powdery rock under your hand, a faint line of color where shade protects the surface. Maybe it is known. Maybe it is not. And after Madjedbebe, every unrecorded shelter carries a sharper possibility. What if the next one does not just add detail, but changes the timeline again? That possibility is what makes the unsurveyed escarpment feel less like empty background and more like unfinished evidence. Getting there is the first problem. Rock shelves can run hard and hot under your boots. Spinifex scratches at your legs. In the build-up, the air feels thick enough to chew, and in the wet, tracks can turn from possible to useless almost overnight. Even before anyone studies a shelter, the country decides how fast that work can happen. Then there is the proper way to enter. Places connected to Madjedbebe's wider story are not just field locations on a clipboard. They sit within living responsibilities, and research has to move with traditional owner knowledge and permission. That slow pace protects the work, but it also means time is always pressing. Fire, rain, insects, salt, heat, and human pressure can all touch rock art and deposits before they are fully recorded. And around this particular shelter, there was another kind of pressure waiting underground. The underground pressure was the Jabiluka mineral lease. Madjedbebe sits within it, which gives the shelter's story a sharper edge than a normal excavation report. On one level, the rock held evidence that could reshape the human story of Australia. On another, the same country sat inside a lease connected to uranium. Those two facts belong in the same breath because they show what kind of pressure deep history can come under. The Mirarr Traditional Owners have long treated this country as something more than land on a project map. For them, the shelter and the surrounding places carry responsibility, memory, and law. It helped the outside world see one part of it in scientific language. You can feel the contrast. Clipboards, permits, samples, machines somewhere in the wider argument, and under the shelter floor. Quiet evidence older than every modern border around it. The final question becomes uncomfortable. If one leased corner of Kakadu could change the arrival timeline, what might the rest of the under-recorded country still be holding? Madjedbebe does not sit quietly inside Australian archaeology anymore. A shelter floor in Kakadu, excavated with Mirarr Traditional Owners and studied through university work, carried a date published in Nature in 2017. About 65,000 years, older by roughly 18,000 years than the consensus many people had learned to trust. Careful scholars can still debate methods and meanings as they should. But the old arrival timeline never looked the same after that. Around it, Kakadu remains unfinished in the scientific sense. Thousands of rock art sites are confirmed, thousands more are estimated. The escarpment still holds places where no vehicle goes, where heat lifts off the stone, where a shaded wall or a buried floor may be waiting for the right people to read it properly. The image to keep is simple. A labelled sample bag leaving the shelter, and beyond it, miles of stone country still unlabelled. If this changed how you think about Kakadu, stay with the channel for more ancient Australian history that deserves a closer look.